Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Seed Savers webinar series. We'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Gabi, and I'll be talking you through the tomato seed saving, kind of ins and outs. Just a little bit about seed savers. Our mission is to save North America's diverse but endangered garden heritage for future generations by building a network of people committed to collecting, conserving, and sharing heirloom seeds and plants while educating people about the value of genetic and cultural diversity. The importance of saving seeds to maintain varieties after they're no longer commercially available can't be expressed enough. Specifically talking about tomatoes, there were 408 different tomato varieties offered in 1903, as you can see pictured in the upper half of that diagram. And in 1983, only 79 of them are still extant. So tomatoes are seed mature and ready for harvest when the fruits are ripe for eating. So in this case, market maturity equals seed maturity. So the point at which you want to eat that fruit is also when it's best to save seed from it. You'll want to make sure to harvest a range of fruit that exhibit all of the characteristics within your population and represent all the healthy plants you have available to you. To remove seeds from the fruit, cut the fruit in half crosswise, kind of along the equator. From there, you're going to be able to see all of the locules inside. Those cavities that you can see inside the tomato fruit, those are called locules, and they are the cavities that hold the seeds and the gel and all that tomatoey goodness in place, kind of allow for that development to happen. So once you've got well, actually, I'm going to go back up to that other slide. So you can see how those locules are oriented, where there's, 3 on the bottom half and then 4-ish on the top half. I just want to explain real briefly why I prefer to cut them along the equator like that instead of, if you will, from pole to pole. I mean, if you can envision cutting that tomato the other way, you're going to have 2 locules at least on both sides of that tomato that are kind of hidden in the back of the fruit by those barriers that are separating the locules from each other. So cutting it in this manner is really going to facilitate the ease in which you're able to squeeze out the most amount of seed from each fruit. And I think it's also, depending on what varieties you're growing, I think it's also really awesome for you to see the difference in what the insides look like. I know that you probably know that from eating them, but it's totally different when you get into seed saving and, you've got a little tomato like this green zebra where, it's got really neat and tidy and distinct locules, and then going to something that has, 20 small locules where it's got, those super, super small cavities where that seed is held, but they really, really are deep. And just getting to know your tomatoes in that sense of where the seeds are located. I think it's really cool and good knowledge for you to have. So we talked about cutting the fruit in half. What you'll do then is we'll scoop or squeeze out the seeds into a tall container. To remove the seeds from their fruit, all you'll do is kind of grab the half that you want and squeeze it into your holding container. And I would recommend that container be see-through so you can see what's going on during the fermentation process. But you can either scoop them out or squeeze. You can scoop them out with a spoon or squeeze them. Here we see Grant squeezing that tomato and moving those seeds from internal to external. And here he's using a spoon just to get the very last ones to come out. Either way, whatever you prefer is kind of up to you. If you only have a few fruit, you might really want to get every single seed out of that fruit. In which case, using a spoon or really sticking your fingers up in those locules to make sure that everything's extracted um, is probably something you want to think about. But if you're not so worried about getting every seed out, then just a pretty firm squeeze and a shake will be really sufficient. Here we see the kind of the what do we call that? The mash of tomato seeds and gel and sugars and juice, and it's ready to be fermented. So what we'll do now is add a little bit of water to the container, which will kind of it'll allow all of those seeds to be suspended. The idea of adding water to the container is not so much to fill it up as it is to suspend all of those seeds in the sugars and the yeasts that are going to allow for that fermentation process to happen. There are a couple cautions with adding water to your container. The first one is that too much water will slow your fermentation process down because those yeasts and that sugar, they have to work a little bit harder to find what they want within the mixture. It's more diluted. So being kind of aware of how much you're adding and whether it really is necessary or not, I would advise. And the second caution is that the fermentation process is there. It happens in nature. When a tomato falls off the plant, it rots. And what that does is that gel coating around your tomato seed has germination inhibitors in it, which tell the seed while it's in the fruit, hey, like we can't sprout now. The conditions aren't right for us to grow. But once that layer is broken down, there's nothing left telling that seed not to germinate. And if it's sitting in nice warm water in 70 degrees, it's entirely possible that if it's let go for too long, that you could start seeing germination issues within the seed that you're fermenting. So paying attention to that is really important. And I recommend, fermenting your seeds for 1 to 3 days at 70 degrees. And what you're going to see after, depending on what temperature you have your mash sitting at, you're going to see this formation of mold on top. I would recommend stirring the seeds in your container at least once a day, just to break up that mold formation a little bit. If it gets too thick and too heavy, it can act to discolor some of your seeds. And that discoloration is going to be fungal growth that's kind of gotten in the seed and eating at the embryo, creating a seed that's not viable any longer. So really making sure that you're stirring that seed up is important. And it also allows every seed to interact equally in the environment that it's in, making sure that all the gel is broken down and that they're not caught in some layer suspended where they're not getting any of that great activity. So we've gone through all those. Stir the mixture daily for 1 to 3 days. When the majority of seed sinks to the bottom of your container, pour off the floating seeds, pulp, and any mold, and pour your seeds into a colander. This may sound kind of scary, but all of your good seeds, if you stir it and let it sit for a minute, all of those seeds that are viable are going to sink to the bottom of your container. So anything that you're pouring off is either a light seed or an undeveloped seed or has some other issue where it's not going to be something that you want to save anyway. So, you know, bite the bullet and do it. Pour off that top layer and pour the rest of it into a colander. And make sure that colander has holes that are small enough that your seed isn't going to go through when you do pour that mash into it. Here we see pictures of the stirring process. Aha! And here's the dumping. Don't be afraid to do this. You can see in this picture, there are still some chunks of that pulp from the fruit left in the container. So depending on what kind of water pressure you have, you may just be ahead if you can dump them out in the beginning and not have to worry about trying to blast them out with your sink, that little pulley sink spray thing. Here you can see all the good seeds that sank to the bottom. And here they are in the colander with some running water on them. If you have access to a garden hose, taking them outside and really giving them a good spray with something that has a little bit of force behind it is not at all a bad idea. It'll allow you to get them a little bit cleaner maybe than your kitchen sink and the faucet there. You might find that you'll want to agitate the seeds a little bit and maybe rub any of the pulp that's still left in there through the screen if the water pressure isn't getting it through. But the general idea is that you want to allow water to flow over those seeds until the water that's leaving the colander is clear, so that you've thoroughly rinsed everything off of the seeds and they're ready to dry. So what you'll do then is spread, once you've got them washed, you'll spread them out on a coffee filter and give them pretty good airflow. You can put the coffee filter in another colander to set in front of a fan, somewhere where they're gonna get an exchange of air and some movement over them so that they dry fairly quickly. As they're drying, you'll need to stir them daily. And when they're dry enough to bend or to break rather than bend under stress, you'll know that they're ready for storage. Just another real quick note on drying seeds. I specify putting them on a coffee filter because if any of you have tried saving tomato seeds before and put them on a paper towel, it's incredibly difficult to remove them from that paper towel. It's actually almost impossible unless you cut the paper towel into little pieces around the seed. They will not stick to the coffee filter, and you'll be able to really easily kind of scratch them off and move them around so that they do have even drying on all surfaces, which is really, really important. And I know I said this before too, but the airflow and the time of drying is also important. It needs to be fairly quick. Like they should be dry to the touch by the next morning. If they're still moist and still wet, you'll probably want to find another spot for them to sit because they're not going to dry fast enough before they start to have fungal problems or mold. So it is pretty important. You've already gone through all this work of growing the plants and saving the seeds. Give them some airflow and just pay attention to them. See what happens. So these have been dried and a beautiful little package has been made for them, and we're ready to put them in there and seal them up. We'll end the presentation by talking real briefly about seed storage. The photo on the screen shows one of the freezers at Heritage Farm that we use for long-term seed storage. Obviously, most of us don't have this type of facility, but home gardeners do require the same type of long-term preservation storage that we do here at Seed Savers. So it's helpful to remember in looking at this that seeds contain embryonic plants that are just waiting for the right conditions to germinate and grow. And these conditions tend to be moisture, oxygen, and warm temperatures, right, to get this process started. So, ideal storage conditions should deprive seeds of these three things, in particular, moisture. So, seeds should be dried thoroughly before storage, kind of passing this break shatter test that we talked about a little bit earlier. Once they are sufficiently dry, storing them in an airtight container in a cool, dry location is pretty much optimal. Cooler temperatures slow down the metabolism of embryonic plants, which allows them to be stored longer. So, that being said, it's not necessarily recommended to store your seeds in a fridge because it's generally too moist, and most containers aren't airtight enough that you're still going to have quite a bit of moisture exchange, even though you're not going to directly see it right away. Just one other note on seed storage. Some gardeners try to store their seeds in the freezer. It's not a necessity for home gardeners unless you're planning on saving your seeds for quite a long time. And it's also kind of tricky because unless your seeds are at a really specific moisture level, it can be harmful to the seeds because even a little bit of moisture inside that embryo and inside that seed, when it expands and freezes, it can rupture the embryo. So just kind of taking those things into consideration and looking at what are your future needs? Are you just saving the seed to use next year? In which case, just putting it in a mason jar, in a darker room on a shelf is probably going to be fine. Whereas if you're looking at, having a longer kind of time frame, definitely doing a little bit more research and delving into the ins and outs of seed storage would be recommended. And, saying that, later this year we will be presenting a separate webinar on seed storage in order to cover additional plant types and really further illustrate the principles we've introduced here and throughout the webinar series.